True story. So when I was a kid, the scout people used to come to our school, and the way they got us was they would show us that they had a fire starting kit, and I was like, sweet, sign me up. My mom was like, no. And so anyway, but I did go just to get the fire starting kit, and so that was a lot of fun. So, but they do a lot of cool stuff, all kinds of great stuff that you can get involved with. A couple of updates too on the building. You guys know we had a major flood come through. You guys walked in, you probably saw the wall. That's getting done. And so our next phase is to get the kids wing completely open, offices and kitchen. And so we're going to have plenty of volunteer opportunities coming up as well. We are in need of someone that can set toilets, which you don't want me doing that because I would flood the whole building. But we need somebody that can set some toilets, because in the kids' room and the pre-K room at the bottom of this ramp, they're the ones that go to the bathroom all the time. And so we built a bathroom into their classroom, but we need some help with some of that. So if you have that skill set, see me or Rick. Rick's like a foot taller than me, but see him out in the lobby if you want to help. It is fall. I am so excited. College football season. I was excited about college football season until yesterday. And so if any of you guys still have any eligibility and can quarterback, you should head to Lexington, and because we could use some help. And so that's going on. This weekend is the start of NFL season. For you guys, I'm going to go and promise you, as an NFL owner, for you guys that don't know, I'm not a fan like all of you all. I'm an actual owner of the Green Bay Packers. And so my promise to you guys is that we are doing our best work to make sure that we do not have to endure another Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowl run. We're all tired of it. If you're a Kansas City fan, we don't like you. And so we're working our best to make that happen. But it is exciting. The weather's changing. We're excited about Fall Fest, all kinds of stuff coming up. If you're new, we're so glad you're here with us. Stop by the Welcome Center on your way out. So this month we are starting a new series, and I am excited about this series. We're going to explore some big ideas starting today. But before we jump into where we're going over the next 3 or 4 weeks, we need to start with a premise that we can all launch from. And so today we're going to start talking about the story of God. And this story, let me go ahead and tell you and give you permission to say this, it is complicated. It is not always neat and clean, and it's full of tension and paradox, but it is a story worth pursuing. And so when we think about faith and understanding God, and really if anybody's taken the time not just to hear someone preach, but to read the Bible, what you see is that it's messy. And there are some really strange stories in the Bible. There are some myths and revelations that take place in this story. And so what we want to do is start painting a picture of clarity for that. Now, I will say this. If you've taken time, and if you ever do our What is the Bible course that we offer, one of the things you're going to see really quickly is this idea. It's one of my favorite quotes. That when we start to paint God and our story and relationship to God with nice, neat lines, we are no longer talking about the God that the Bible presents. It can be complicated, it can be fusing, and so it's one of those things that it's worth exploring. But what happens often when we think of God is we try to put him in this box so that we can understand him, and that's okay, but the story itself is actually really complicated. So we're going to start unpacking some of that today. And let me go ahead and say before we start, it is naive of me to think that I can present the whole idea of what we need to talk about in 35 minutes. Because we are going to cover thousands of years of human history in about 35 minutes. And so that is naive of me to even think we can do that. But we want to start and get a baseline and help you maybe think outside of the box in this. Now, in order to do this, I'm just going to tell a story today. And the story is a deep story. It's a complicated story, but it's the story of us as human beings, okay? And so imagine that you are an early human being in human history, and so you are one of these early communities and developments and cultures that we see. Now, full disclosure, some of the early civilizations that we see actually even predate the biblical narratives. And so you're a human being, and you're trying to understand who you are and how you got here and what you're actually supposed to be doing. Now, early on in human history, what we see is that people start to develop these ideas. And one of the ideas they develop, in order to be a human, you need certain things in order to survive. And one of the things that you need to survive is you need food, you need oxygen, you need water, you need all of these things. And so early man and some of these early civilizations and cultures, they start to notice this idea that they need these things to survive, like they need plants and vegetables and fruits in order to eat and survive. And what they notice is there seems to be, you can answer it, there seems to be some forces outside of their control that impact what they're able to gather when it comes to what they need to survive. And so they start to notice that, like, hey, so sometimes, like, it rains a lot and it washes out kind of the vegetation, and then sometimes, like, it's really hot and this big fireball in the sky. If it gets too hot, then it dries everything up. And so they start to realize that there maybe is some rhythms to these things and some forces outside of them that dictate this. And then they also learn that they need to hunt other animals in order to survive. And so what they do is they go on these hunts, and they go on these hunts to gather these things to bring back to their communities and their families so they can eat. And at night, when the hunters are kind of gathering around the fire, they start to share stories about these ideas that, like, it seems like sometimes we go on these hunts and it seems like that the animals are just waiting for us. And then other times we go on the hunt and it feels like we're out there for days and weeks and even months, and we come back with hardly anything. And it seems like maybe there's these forces, these ideas bigger than them that kind of are dictating some of these situations. And then as human beings start to evolve, it no longer becomes just about going and gathering fruits and vegetables or going and going on a hunt. They start to create livestock and they start to create crops. And we go from hunter-gatherers to this idea of we're starting to gather these things and create them. But even within that system, they notice that sometimes when they have livestock, it seems like the offspring are produced in abundance. And sometimes it seems like they hardly get any offspring, or maybe they're planting in their vineyards and their gardens, and sometimes it seems like everything goes well and they have an abundance of food, and other times it seems like there is hardly any at all. And so they start to think, like, are there forces outside of just these things that we need in order to survive? And they come to the conclusion in these early civilizations that there are forces that they are now dependent on in order to be able to survive as human beings. And what they start to do is give these forces attributes. And they start to give these forces not only attributes, but also give them names. And so what we see is these forces start to take on identities, and eventually these forces start to become gods that they worship. In fact, the region in which the biblical narrative takes place out of is in Mesopotamia and in Samaria. And what we see is these early humans, they start to create these forces, these identities that eventually become deities and gods. And there are a lot of them. In fact, in the Mesopotamia region, there's An, who's the sky god. There's Enlil, who is the god of storms. There's Enki, who's the god of fresh water. There's Ishtar, who's the goddess of love, fertility, and war, which seems like a lot they've got to cover there, okay? You have Utu, which is one of my favorite gods to say. He is the sun god and the god of justice. And then they have Nani, or Sin, who is the moon god. And what they realize is all of these forces, whether it's the sun, the moon, it's weather, whether it's interpersonal relationships, there's a lot to these deities. They even, in the Sumerian region, have a specific god. Her name was Nikasi. Nikasi is the goddess of beer. All right? And so they loved Nikasi in their culture. And so they would write songs about Nikasi. One of the songs they wrote is that what she makes is like the Tigris and the Euphrates coming together. These are two rivers. So next time you're throwing a party, put on your flyer, it's like the Tigris and Euphrates coming together. And nobody's going to show up. But in their culture, that was a big deal. And so you have that region. Then you also have the Babylonians. And so the Babylonians are another kind of sect that eventually overtakes that Mesopotamian region. But they have gods themselves. One of the most famous one is Marduk, not the comic strip with the dog, but a god named Marduk. And Marduk is their main god, and Marduk is the god of creation. In fact, the story goes that Marduk goes to battle the chaos monster, which is Tiamat, and when he defeats Tiamat, he takes her body and he forms the earth and the world as we know it. And Tiamat is the goddess of destruction and chaos. And so the story that takes place in the Enuma Elish, which is their kind of early Iliad of creation in the Babylonian region, is the idea that Marduk took chaos and created order out of it. Sound familiar? They had other gods like Utu and Sin, who's the moon god, and Ishtar and Nabu and Adid and Bel, the lord of the other gods, and then Sabata, the warrior god, and then Gulu, the goddess of healing and mercy, and then Naturi, the goddess of hunting, agriculture, and war. Again, they realized that, at least in their mind, there were these gods that controlled these forces. Then you have the Egyptian region, and they have Atum as one of the oldest, another creator god that they worship. They have Ra, who's the sun god that maybe you've heard of, and they have Nun, which is the god of the waters, and then they had the god Shu, which is the god of air and light, and they have Tefut, which is the god of moisture and rain and agriculture. They had Geb, which is the goddess of the earth and the ground, and then they have Nut, which is the god of the sky. So all that to say, and that's just one region, we didn't even get into Asia, they had all of these gods, and all of these gods, again, in their mind, controlled the forces that allowed them to be able to live. Now, what they started doing was realizing that in order for us to continue to live, we need to keep the gods' favor. Because if the gods are the ones that decide how we live and the state in which we live, and if we survive, and if our crops are good, and if our livestock is good, and if we have success on the hunt, we need to appease these gods and let them know that we're grateful for what they've given us. And so in early human history, what we see is this system start to develop where they decide they're going to start offering back a portion of what they've received back to the gods to show their gratitude. This system starts pretty primitive at first, but eventually we get to the point where one distinctive feature sticks out, and that becomes the altar system. The idea that you would go up, and they usually went up on a mountain or a high place or an important place, and they would build an altar, and they would sacrifice a portion of what they had received back to the gods. And so they'd take a pile of rocks, or they would build a structure of some sorts, and they would usually light it on fire and burn it so that the smoke and the incense from whatever they were offering would go up to the gods, because in their mind, the gods were always up. Now, this system starts to take off, but there's still confusion on how much do we offer and what do we offer and how do we do it and when do we do it and all of these things. And so within these early cultures, there starts to become these men that arise within these civilizations and cultures and communities, and they start to become the experts on order to make the gods happy. They become experts on the altar system. We would refer to them as similar to what we would call like priests. They are the experts of being the in-between between the gods and man. And they would give you ideas and examples and help you understand the things you're supposed to do in order to make the gods happy. They become this in-between between gods and humans. The altar system has a major flaw, though. And here's the major flaw in the altar system. So let's say that you're sacrificing, you're giving back your portion to the gods. And let's say that year you had an incredible livestock, or you had your garden or your vineyard produced greatly. Well, the problem is you don't want to offer the same amount you offered the year before, because then all of a sudden it seems like maybe you're not very grateful. And if you're not grateful, then why would the gods continue to bless you? Or maybe it's the system of you didn't have a good year and your crops or your hunt didn't go very well. And so you have this feeling like you need to offer more and more in order to make the gods happy. And what we see in early human civilizations is there becomes this anxiety within the altar system, because you actually never knew where you stood with the gods. Had you offered enough? Had you done enough? Had you sacrificed enough? And if you didn't, what do you do? Because you want to be in good standing with the gods. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever felt like that? Where you didn't know where you stood with God? And so like there's this anxiety and worry that starts to creep in is, are you giving enough? Are you sacrificing enough? Are you doing enough? Because you weren't sure where you stood with God. At some point in the system, these priests and these leaders, they start to kind of branch out and they say, okay, things aren't going well because we're offering these crops, we're offering this portion of our livestock or a portion of our hunt to the gods, but things still aren't going well. And so how do we expand this even further? How do we give more in order to appease them? And eventually it gets to the point where we have examples of like the worshipers of Baal who began to cut themselves, literally physically harm their bodies in order to show the gods how serious they were about what they would sacrifice. There's a goddess that starts to become popular in a region in South Asia at that point called the goddess Sibyl. She is the goddess of fertility and life, and they worshipped her. She was one of their main gods in this region. Now, in order to appease this god, what they would do is they would take a portion of their men within their community, and they would walk them up to this mountain, a mountain you can still go to today, and to this temple, and the men there would castrate themselves. If you go on that tour, just be careful where you sit, okay? And slow burn for some of you guys. Okay, so here's what would happen is you're now offering parts of yourself. But in some regions, even that wasn't enough. One of the regions that we see that the writers of the Bible talk about, specifically in the book of Leviticus, is a god named Molech. And Molech is the firstborn of the henna goddess. And the thing about them was it wasn't just cutting yourselves or offering a piece of yourself. They actually demanded life. And what they learned over trial and error was it seemed the life that appeased Molech, the god, the most was the life of children. And so they would sacrifice children in order to appease the gods. So the problem is, with this system, is you don't know where you stand with these forces. Am I doing enough? Am I offering enough? Am I sacrificing enough? And we look at that system and we say, how primitive. Like how barbaric and primitive of these people to think that if they just kept offering more and more that it would appease these forces. Until you think about today. Now, we don't no longer worship Ra or Nun or Sin or Utu or Nakasi, but we still have gods. We just call them by different names. Like we have the god of success, the god of acceptance, the god of popularity, the god of wealth. And we still have altars that we sacrifice to and sacrifice on. It's just our altars have changed to now they're our lives. And see, you could look at like the people that worship the god Molech and say like, how could anyone sacrifice a child in order to appease a god? And yet in our culture, I see people sacrificing their children all the time for success, for wealth. Today we sacrifice just as much in different ways. Success often costs us our families. Wealth often costs us our integrity. And popularity often costs us our peace. And so we can shake our heads and we could do this, but we also sacrifice our children and families to busyness, neglect, or the relentless pursuit of achievement. I mean, how primitive is that? So we still have gods, we just call them by different names. And so the system keeps developing. Now, the fascinating thing when you open the Bible is this story that is not detached from human history and time and space. And if you remember that when you read the Bible, it will help you greatly in understanding it. But it comes from within and is woven into these early cultures and the stories of man and what we're supposed to be doing. And God works within this history, or maybe it's humans work within God's history. And so you get to this point where God is going to make this moment stick out. And we see this moment stick out in the 12th chapter of the Bible. We find the beginning of the story of a guy named Abram. And in this story, Abram, or we refer to him as Abraham, hears from God. Now, mind you, go back into history and remind yourself that in their culture, nobody heard from the gods. You sacrificed, you gave, you hoped that you appealed to the gods, and there were some priests that would give you some pointers, but the idea of a God stepping into the story and us hearing from him is revolutionary. The gods were somewhere else doing their own bidding, and we just had to hope that we fit within their schedule. In the beginning of this story, in the Sumerian region, the same Sumerian region that we just talked about in Mesopotamia, what we see is this God steps in, and this story starts to come out of it, of these people, the Hebrew people. And this one man sticks out in this story, and his name is Abraham. And Abraham is told by God that he is the creator God, like he is the God, later referred to in Moses' story as the I am, like I am it. And he becomes this divine voice in his life. Now, one of the major details is what God is about to do through Abraham. he offers them this. And he says, here's what's going to happen. He says, your descendants one day will outnumber the stars in the sky. Now, this is a fascinating detail in the story because in that region, specifically that we see Abraham come out of, one of the main gods for them was the god Dinger. Dinger is the star god. And God takes one of the main gods of that region and uses it as a prop in the story that he's about to tell. He tells Abraham to leave his father's household and that there's this new thing about to happen through what he's doing. Now, there's this ancient Jewish story about the day that Abraham leaves. Because in order to leave your father's household, it's not like today where you go to college and then you leave or whatever. Like, leaving your father's household means you're walking away from everything that you've been identified with, everything that made you you. And in that culture and region, it wasn't like today where you would move to different regions of the United States or even different parts of the world. Like, you primarily always stayed within that region. You had the same gods, same ideas, same kind of philosophies and all of this thing. And Abraham steps away from all of that. And in this Jewish fable, it says the day that Abraham leaves his father's household, that he's packing up all of his stuff and he sees on his father's living room in his shelf all of the idols to all of the gods that we just named that Abraham's father worshipped. And so he gets frustrated by this situation, and so he pulls out an axe. And he goes to these wooden statues and he starts to chop all of these wooden statues up. And he chops them all up and leaves them on the floor except for one. And what he does is he takes the axe and he puts it in that last statue's hand. And the next morning his father wakes up and he calls Abraham in and he says, what happened to all of my idols? What happened to all of my gods? And Abraham looks at the one holding the axe and says, looks like that one did it. And Abraham's father replies, no, Abraham, I built those with my own hands. Those are just statues and idols. And Abraham says to his father, then why do you bow down and worship them? And this story starts to take off about a God who interacts with man. Something new is happening. Peter Enns says it this way. God adopted Abraham as the forefather of a new people, and in doing so, he also adopted the mythic categories within which Abraham and everyone else in that time thought. But God did not simply leave Abraham in this mythic world. Rather, God transformed the ancient myths so that Israel's story would come to focus on its God, the real one. And this voice grows within Abraham's life. And we see this story that we see in Genesis start to unfold. And one of the promises that lured Abraham was this promise his descendants would outnumber the stars in the skies. The problem is we know that Abraham and his wife to this point have not been able to have children. And so there's some mishaps along the way. You should read your Bible and study it. But eventually Isaac is born. And Isaac is this descendant that all of these other descendants are going to come from. And it's this amazing story until we get to Genesis chapter 22. And in Genesis chapter 22, God looks at Abraham and tells him that he must offer Isaac as a sacrifice to him. In fact, he says it this way, you are to kill your son whom you love. This is the first mention of the word love in the Bible. And it's the story about a father who will sacrifice his son. The light should start going off now for you. So Abraham is about to sacrifice his son. And what's crazy is this isn't earth-shattering for Abraham. It's not some random request for him to do. Because remember, in their culture, in their day and age, the gods could ask anything of you. And if the gods asked you, and this God asked you to sacrifice your son, then you have no other choice. You have to do it. And so the story goes that Abraham takes his son and they go to this mountain and they unload all of their stuff and they're walking up this mountain. And what's so messed up about this story when you think about it is Abraham's walking up and he's carrying some of the supplies and Isaac is carrying up the wood. In fact, there's this part of the story where Isaac looks at Abraham and he says, Father, we have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Scriptures speak about Abraham being a good man. Why is he a good man? Because he's willing to kill his son? And what about Isaac? Like, how much therapy is this kid going to need, right? I mean, he's carrying it. He's asking his father what's about to happen. And Abraham's good because he's willing to kill his son. Let's flannel graph that for the kids in the back and see if they like that lesson. So a couple questions. Why is Abraham okay with this? Because this is what the gods demand. And they can take what's most valuable to you, and there's nothing you can do about it. So they walk up the mountain. They build the altar. Abraham places Isaac on the altar. And right when he's about to sacrifice his son, God steps in. And God says, no, we're not doing this. And he looks at Abraham. He says, over there in the thicket, you're going to find a ram caught. And I want you to take that ram and I want you to sacrifice it. This is a different story. Which leads us to a question. Was this whole thing a prop? Was the whole thing a prop for God to show how he's different than all of the other gods that have been before? How he's different. This is a whole new day. This will not be a story about the greatness of Abraham, but the greatness of God. And Abraham, in that moment, he realizes what's going on and that God had provided, which he believed would be provided for the entire time. And in fact, he takes Isaac off the altar. They sacrifice the ram, and he renames that place. And he renames it Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. This is going to be a story about a God who will provide. Not a God that you have to live in restless anxiety, worrying where you stand. It offers a whole new possibility. Now, the story continues on, and we've covered the Moses story before, but right after the Exodus story, we get into this interesting book in the Bible called Leviticus. Now, how many of you guys have read Leviticus all the way through? All the way through? You just lied for most of you, okay? It is a hard read at times. But what's fascinating is when you look at it through the lens of human history, remember this primitive system in which you had to offer all of these sacrifices, and even after offering the sacrifices, you never knew where you stood with the gods. And we look at that and we first read Leviticus, it sounds a little primitive and barbaric until you see what's actually going on. That God is taking this system and he's telling the people exactly what you have to do. You don't have to question or worry anymore. If you do these things, if you sacrifice in these ways, then come near to me and you and me will be good. It's this invitation that God isn't distant like all the other gods, that he wants to draw man near. And so you would go through these rituals and you would offer these sacrifices. And usually at the end of most of these sacrifices, there was a celebration because this is the idea that you could be made right and within right standing of God. There was one particular offering that comes out of that in the book of Leviticus, and it was called the peace offering. And in the peace offering, what you do is you would sacrifice an animal, and you would take a portion of that animal, and you would sacrifice it towards God. But then you would take the rest of that animal, the rest of that meat, and you would invite your friends and your family and your neighbors over, and you would prepare a feast. And you would sit in that feast and you would talk about the blessings of God and the goodness of God. And you could sit in that meal knowing that you were at peace, not only with God, but also with each other. That was completely unheard of at that time. And so the system continues to develop, and like humans do, there becomes a problem. This system eventually grows into a machine. It starts with the altar, and then we see the temple, and eventually the priestly courts. And this huge system develops, as you can read throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Again, I'm covering a lot of time and a little bit of time, a lot of space and a little bit of time. And this idea about performing sacrifices, this is how you can know God. And within this system, we see these priests rise up, and eventually these religious leaders rise up. And one of the groups of leaders that eventually rises up are the Sadducees. And the Sadducees are kind of these religious kind of leaders and lawyers, and they work with the priests and all of these things. And they determine in ways in which the sacrificial system will work. And what starts to happen, we see, is that money and profit starts to become intertwined with faith and religion. Which, by the way, never ends well. And so what starts to happen is this system starts to go off the rails. And what we see is some of these religious leaders, specifically the Sadducees and some of the Pharisees, they start to accumulate great wealth and power through this system. And so around 2,000 years ago, we see a system that's turned into a place where the masses are starving And yet the religious leaders, specifically the Sadducees, are living in villas and surrounded by opulence, wealth, and power. And it becomes this huge, massive system that was once meant to serve the people so they could know they were within right standing of God. And now it's oppressing them. It's a system based on violence and power and fear and confusion. Completely unlike the leaders of today, right? There's even points in the Old Testament when God calls it out. He tells them they've misunderstood what he was trying to do. And through prophets, he tries to speak into these situations. In fact, over 10 times we see these ideas of how they've abused the system. And the most famous comes from Hosea 6, chapter 6. And when God says through the prophet, he says this, I don't want your sacrifices. I want your love. I don't want your offerings. I want you to know me. And the system, again, goes off the rails. And all of a sudden within the system, we see another system of anxiety and worry pop up. Have we sacrificed enough? Have we done enough? And the people wonder where they stand with God. And now it's not just about the altar, but the temple. There's this man that stands in front of the temple around the turn of the first century. And he stands there and he's looking at this massive temple, the second temple to be built. The first temple was destroyed earlier. And he looks at this system and he's standing there and he looks at everything going on and all of the fear and the anxiety and the worry of the people. And he looks at the temple that was supposed to be the answer for a time, and yet it's turned itself into something else. And he stands in front of the temple and this man says, one greater than the temple is here. And he doesn't just say these words, he shows it. There's a scene where Jesus, he walks into the temple and he sees the money changers. He sees the people who are taking advantage of the system that was supposed to serve the people and how it's completely warped and become something different. And he goes in, and this Jesus that's known for being the one of peace, he takes whips and cords and he drives out all of the money changers from the temple. From this place of sacrifice that is supposed to be symbolic and holy, and it's become something completely else. Today, when people want to make a point about a sermon or preach, what we do is we gather people, you sit in a room, we put a TV on, we put up some slides with some great quotes and some points. Sometimes they're 3, sometimes they're 7, sometimes like me. I don't know sometimes what points I'm trying to make, but they're there, okay? And so you would do this and you present information. But in their culture, if you wanted to communicate and make a presentation, you didn't do it just through words, you did it through action. You did it through guerrilla theater. So in John chapter 2, Jesus is standing there in front of the temple. And here's what he says. Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. And they replied, it has taken 46 years to build this temple and you're going to raise it in 3 days. Which isn't entirely true. It had taken 46 years to build that temple, but it had taken hundreds of years before that to rebuild the temple. But the temple he spoke of in verse 21 was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said, and they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. By the way, this had nothing to do with my sermon, but just a point. If you ever wrestle with faith and all of these details and complications of this, just know it took the disciples a resurrected Jesus to believe the things that he'd said. Jesus claims that if people would destroy the temple, he would rebuild it in 3 days. And some of them had no idea what he was talking about, because he wasn't talking about an altar anymore. He wasn't talking about a building. He was talking about something completely new. A once-for-all way to be near to God. The God that wants to draw us near. The God is not distant. And this current system, it had gone off the rails. And the current system also had a vested interest in allowing the system to continue. And so Jesus, he stands up against the system. And eventually that costs him his life. There's times throughout Jesus' story that Jesus could have met violence with violence, but he didn't. I love this quote by Peter Enns. He says this, when the dust clears and in the quiet of your heart, what kind of God do you believe in and why? Every time Jesus is tempted to fight violence with violence, he refuses. See, if he had just done that and done the old system the way that everybody else had done it, through power and violence and all of these things, it would have been nothing new. It would have been what men had been doing over and over and over again. And Jesus is offering something completely new. The story is moving forward. And the first Christians, they wrestled with this because they had grown up in this temple system. But something new was happening. The writer of Hebrews explains what happened this way. Hebrews 9:26. But he, speaking of Jesus, has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages, which is an amazing line, to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Essentially, what Jesus is doing is changing the story. It's changing the narrative. Jesus is a turning point in human history and the way in which we understand and relate to God. See, a minute ago I asked you guys a question when I was talking about the sacrificial system. And I said, is part of our problem that we have this anxiety of never knowing where we stand with God? And let's just be honest, we all do. And so the writers of the New Testament, specifically Paul, he wants to change the narrative through what Jesus has done. And listen to what he says in Colossians. This is amazing. And through him, speaking of Jesus, God reconciled everything to himself. He made peace with all things in heaven and on earth by the means of Christ's blood on the cross. This includes you who were once far away from God. You were his enemies, separated from him by your evil thoughts and actions, and yet now he has reconciled you to himself through the death of Christ in his physical body. As a result, now before we read all this, you know all that anxiety and worry you have? As a result, he has brought you into his own presence, and you are holy and blameless as you stand before him without a single fault. Some of you in this room have never been blameless your entire lives, or so you thought. And the idea of being holy, I mean, I could write a book on all the faults that I have. And so we live in this place of anxiety. And what the writer tells us here is through what Jesus has done through this sacrifice, it's changed everything. Christ is the ultimate example of how God enters the messiness of our story, of our history, to save his people. And so for the first Christians, they heard this. And they were messed up and flawed and riddled with anxiety and worry and all of these things. And they hear this news of what Christ has done, of what Jesus has done. And so here's what they say. Well, that sounds like good news. That sounds like a good deal. That sounds like what we've been looking for. That sounds like the answer to everything throughout human history that we've been working towards. And so this movement of this story, it starts with restless humans trying to appease the forces they couldn't control, to Abraham meeting a God who speaks to them, who provides for him, to Leviticus revealing a God who wants to draw near for us and give us ways to draw near to him, to the prophets declaring that God doesn't want empty sacrifices, but love and mercy and relationship, to Jesus stepping into the temple system and turning the whole thing upside down. And every step along this progression of this story that we see unfold is God saying, you don't have to wonder where you stand with me. You can know. You don't have to live with anxiety about whether he's angry or distant. Because the good news is, if you want to know what God is like, you don't have to guess. You don't have to look at the weather or the cycles of the moon anymore, or the success of your crops or the ups and the downs of your life. You don't have to look at an altar and whether you've sacrificed enough or given enough or burned enough or done enough or sacrificed enough people or lives or things. You don't have to look at a temple anymore that takes advantage of you and shortchanges you and takes advantage of your wealth and your popularity and all of these things. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. If you want to understand where you stand with God, he simply says, just look at Jesus. Look at the one who touched the lepers and said, be clean. Look at the one who welcomed children while others pushed them away. Look at the one who spent time and dined with the outcast of society and community and the people that they said he should not even be in the same room with. Look at the people he found in their sin, the woman caught in adultery, and yet he lifts her up instead of condemning her. And look at the one who stretched out his arms not to demand another sacrifice, but to be the sacrifice. The writer of Hebrews tells us that Jesus is the exact representation of God's being. John tells us that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and he was full of grace and truth. And Jesus himself said, "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." So the final word of this story is this: God is not distant. God is not angry. God is a God who gives and a God of grace. When John is writing his letters to the church, he tries to describe God in one word. And he simply says, God is love. And the good news is you and I can know him. Let's pray. Father God, we love you and we thank you. And God, I thank you for this unfolding story that hopefully my rambling made sense of. That throughout human history, this complex that we find ourselves in of anxiety and worrying where we stood with you and all of these things. And then you enter into this story of man from the beginning and you do this thing where you want to tell us the story of who you are. And through Abraham, you make these promises that turn out to be true because the descendants of Abraham and the people of faith in this world that descend from that story outnumber the stars in the sky. And you carry that story into this idea of us being able to know as humans where we stand with you to the point where you offer Jesus a once and for all idea. Where most of us in this room who walked in here knowing what we've done, what we've said, this fear, this anxiety, this worry of are we good enough? Have we done enough? And you offer us the promise that through Jesus and him interceding for us and us stepping into him, that in his presence we are holy and blameless. And that should wipe away, God, the anxiety and the fear that we have of who you are and what you are. And God, that you're a God that wants to know us, and you're a God that wants us to know you. And so, God, help us to work through some of those feelings and emotions that come through that. Help us to be willing to work through the complicated story and the messiness of it throughout human history and the history of the Bible and all these stories of these men and these women who wrestle with these things just as we do, and how you continue to be this constant and steady and working through those things. So God, my prayer is that we know how big of a God you are, how loving of a God you are, how graceful of a God you are, how God that offers mercy. And may we see all that through what you've done through Jesus. And may we not just know you and know that information, but we actually believe it. And it drives the core of who we are, and it drives our lives. So Father, we thank you and we love you for the good news of what you've given us. So we pray all these things in your Son's name. Amen.